Hi, Misha here, and we're continuing to look at British tanks, specifically the cruiser tanks. It's kind of funny, they did not mean to start naming these all with C, but by this point, late in World War II, that is the convention, just as anti-tanks are named with A's and so on and so forth. But in the beginning, it was kind of random. Last time we talked about the Cromwell and that whole debacle. The A-24, the A-27L, the A-27M. Today, we're going to talk about the Comet, the A-34. Helpfully just named the tank cruiser Comet Mark I. They kind of finally dropped the whole thing because it was getting crazy with all the marks and things, so they are simplifying. And the whole idea here, they wanted a high velocity gun on a cruiser chassis. So we will talk about that. And it did see service in World War II. Like the others, this model is 1/72 scale die-cast. This one is from Hobbymaster, so one of the nice ones. One of the big things that Hobbymaster does that's nice on these, they do metal guns. At least when they're the larger guns. If they're small ones, like say a 2-pounder, they'd probably still have to do plastic. But when they can, they do metal. And as you can tell, this is just another iteration of that. Now, Birmingham had a winner on their hands with the Cromwell. And the British wanted a high-velocity gun, and Vickers had been working on it. This would be the QF-76, the original 17-pounder. And they would make a version with a larger tank ring, turret ring and everything, known as the Challenger Cruiser Mark 8. And they would put the Challenger into production to make room and just make it work. It was pretty lightly armored and it had a pretty bulbous turret. And they would build about 200. The problem, it was too much of a compromised design, and while it wasn't terrible, the Sherman Firefly, also fitted with the 17-pounder gun, was better in a lot of ways and more plentiful and cheaper. So the Challenger from Birmingham was pretty short-lived. But this allowed Leyland here to come back after losing out because of the Centaur, at least in some aspects, with the Comet. The Challenger was known as the A-30. The prototype version of this was known as the A-34. And the first so-called mild steel prototype was ready for testing in February of 1944. And by September of 1944, the final specs were ready and production would commence. So what do we have here? Well, in a lot of ways, it's kind of a return to more of a traditional Cromwell type hull. It has a smaller turret. I mean, it's larger than a Cromwell, but it's smaller than the Challenger. And the big deal here was a new version of the 17-pounder gun, known as the 17-pounder high velocity. It used shorter rounds. Used the same projectile as the others, but it used the charge from the older 3-inch howitzer, which just let everything fit better. Technically still a 76.2 millimeter. Often it's called a 77 millimeter just to distinguish it. Kind of a special thing. Even though it's unique to this tank, it's using components from other things, something Britain has been doing all throughout the war, recycling and chopping and redoing. But it allowed for a smaller, lower profile turret. It also allowed for more rounds on board. The Challenger only held, I think, 42, whereas the Comet here held 60 or even up to 62. So quite a bit better ammunition capacity and easier for the loaders to work with. In other ways, it was a lot like the other tanks. It is heavier, about 31 to 33 tons, depending on how laden it is. Has a crew up to 5. We have the hull machine gun position here. We have quite the long barrel gun. Overall length, because of this new gun, is about 25 feet. We're 32 miles per hour, but again, we're limited. In fact, this one of the other changes they have, they went to the Mark II version of the Meteor engine. Some improvements there. You notice it has a bigger kind of cover or vent, deflector. I'm going to call that. I don't know. You know what I mean? Compared to on the Cromwell. It's also, this is more of a single piece. This one's split internally more. Just, work better with the new engine. Otherwise, it still has the two 7.9 machine guns. And yeah, most other ways is pretty commensurate. Pretty much on the same level as everything else. And it worked quite well. They were actually planning to re-equip units beginning in December of 1944, and some units even started to hand in their Shermans, but then the Battle of the Bulge happened, and so they had to go back to their Shermans, fight the Battle of the Bulge, and then in January of 1945, start re-equipping with the Comet. And it was well received. It kept pace with the other tanks, and it allowed them to have more of a unified fleet. Pretty much had the best attributes of the Firefly, the Cromwell, and the Challenger without the drawbacks. So instead of having to field 3 or 4 different types, they pretty much went down to these. Now that said, they never fully replaced their divisions. In fact, only one division fully transitioned over to the new Comet Mark I. The rest were still using M4 Shermans, Sherman Fireflies, and Cromwells. But they were producing these in large numbers. By the time the war ended in May, they built just under 1,200. And of course it stopped there because end of the war and budget cuts. It never was in any major large-scale engagements, but it was there in Germany. It fought in quite a few mopping up operations and seek and destroy missions. And it was there crossing the Rhine and was terribly effective against Panzers, Panthers, and Tigers, even the Tiger too. And the new 17-pounder high-velocity gun, the 77mm, really was a good compromise for everything and finally gave them that high-velocity dual purpose. It gave them a gun as good as what the Sherman was mounting, and that's kind of what they've been wanting for years. And since the Russians were showing off their new tanks after the war, the British had these in their Victory Day parade in the summer of 1945 as well. So production was pretty much over, but it was the ultimate culmination of this whole series, and it would stay in service for a number of years. It would be in frontline service during Korea, and then would kind of be retired to second-line service in the 50s, and would be phased out by 1960 like the other tanks here, the Cromwell, and some of the older cruisers. In fact, one might say it was the last of the true cruisers, because after that, the whole main battle tank concept kind of comes in. But that's for another video. These were exported a little bit. For example, South Africa used about 24 of these and would use them for quite a long time. Ireland had about 8. One interesting user was Cuba. In 1957 to 1958, the Batista government, the dictatorship, would acquire about 15. And of course, that meant the communist government, Fidel, would inherit these. However, since they could not get spare parts due to embargo, they didn't stay in service all that long as they would break down. And with only 15, what do you do? Actually, I think maybe the largest user of the Comet outside of the UK was Finland, of all places. They acquired over 40, and kept them in service through the 1970s. Yeah, worked well for them, relatively small, good high velocity. And by the way, these were better armored than the Challenger. They had at least 4 inches of armor, and it was more consistent. But it's still very squared off. They haven't really gone to the sloped concept, except here and there. By the way, I didn't really mention it in previous videos, but for what it's worth, these cruiser tanks are using the Christie suspension system, which is kind of interesting. They didn't use a lot of sloped armor because that was another Christie innovation. It did appear on a couple of British tanks, but just not these. So these would be retired out, but did see limited combat in World War II. They lost about 24 in that war due to enemy action. Not bad. And they definitely punched above that, taking out numerous German vehicles, tanks, rail cars, what have you. And this is really about the only major version. Of course, it's the British, so there's lots of marks and stars and everything else. But this is all there really was to speak of as far as major. So in the way, Leyland kind of won this competition. But of course, there was one more tank that saw service in World War II, although not combat. But again, I think next time we'll visit the Sherman Firefly, because it is also another important tank, and was built in large numbers. So that'll be then. Let me know what you think of these. They're a lot of fun to do, although the British stuff is pretty confusing. All the marks and stuff, the turret moves, gun moves. Like I said, one nice thing about the Hobby Master, the guns are metal, holes metal. Of course, this kind of stuff's plastic. Tracks are rubber. And they come with a nice case cover. And if you want to put these on a diorama, you can unbolt them. They just have usually 1 to 2 screws in the bottom holding them on. Yeah. I hope you're enjoying these, because I'm enjoying making them. If you could, please do like, share, subscribe, and as always, please do feel free to comment below. This is Misha. Catch you very soon.